My 16-year-old and her friends like the movie, the screening, the best, which I take to be, first of all, the highest compliment because there is no tougher critic, but also great, good hope.
At 76, Meryl Streep is finally pulling back the curtain on a celebrated dapper leading man during the Hollywood Renaissance, Robert Redford. All his years, the world saw him as the untouchable golden boy of Hollywood, a man of silence and mystery. But Meryl, the woman who shared his most intimate cinematic moments, is finally exposing the actual man behind those piercing blue eyes. From the secrets of the African plains to the heartbreaking reality of his final days, this is Redford, Uncovered. What really happened in Africa? 76 and Meryl Streep isn't just an icon, as she is the keeper of Hollywood's most intimate secrets. That's what makes her a great confidant of her co-stars all throughout the years, including Robert. And when she finally decided to speak about the actual Robert Redford, the world stopped. For years, we've held on to this image of Redford as the untouchable, golden-haired titan, a man so private he was almost a myth. But Meryl? She lived the reality. She saw the cracks in the armor, the hidden vulnerabilities, and the surprising clumsiness of the man who redefined the American leading man. When she calls him divine, she isn't just using a Hollywood adjective. She's exposing a deep, complicated friendship that began under the scorching Kenyan sun and lasted until his very last breath in 2025. You want to get the exposure Meryl is bringing to light, you have to go back to 1985. We're talking about Out of Africa, a film that won 7 Oscars and gave us one of the most romantic images in cinema history. But behind that sweepingly beautiful landscape, Meryl reveals a set that was anything but a fairy tale. She's finally pulling back the curtain on the actual conditions of that shoot. And let's just say the romance was hard-earned. The centerpiece of this exposure is the legendary hair-washing scene. You know the one. Redford's Dennis Finch Hatton tenderly washing Meryl's Karen Blixen by a river, reciting poetry as the water ripples.
Laughed loud and long, and all the while, his eyes went to and fro.
It's been voted one of the most romantic scenes of all time. But Meryl's exposure of what actually happened is both hilarious and surprisingly tender. She recently admitted that when they first started, Redford, the man every woman in the world wanted to be near, was actually quite bad at it. He was tentative, almost awkward. He didn't know how to handle the intimacy of the moment. Meryl reveals that her longtime hairstylist, Roy Helund, actually had to step in. He took Redford aside like a nervous student and gave him a literal shampooing 101 lesson. Can you imagine? The great Robert Redford being taught how to lather hair because he was too shy to get it right. But here is where Meryl exposes the real Bob. He didn't get offended. He didn't let his ego get in the way. He took the lesson, practiced. And by take 5, Meryl says she was so in love, she didn't want the day to end. She calls it a scene in a way because of the sheer care and touch involved. Something she says is missing from modern graphic cinema. She's exposing the fact that Redford's greatest strength wasn't his looks, but his ability to learn how to be truly, deeply present with another human being. But the real Redford on that set wasn't just a romantic lead. He was a man facing down real, life-threatening danger alongside Meryl. This is the part of the story the studio PR didn't want you to know back in the 80s. Meryl has recently exposed the terrifying reality of the Kenyan wilderness. While they were filming that intimate river scene, they were warned about the hippopotamus population just upstream. Now, most people think hippos are cute, but as Meryl pointed out, they are the most dangerous animals in Africa. One wrong move, one territorial hippo, and the Golden Boy and the Iron Lady would have been history. And then there were the lions. Meryl revealed that the production brought in lions from California, claiming they were tame. Spoiler alert, they were not. She tells stories of lions lunging at the crew and Redford standing his ground with a quiet, stoic bravery that wasn't just for the cameras. This is the Redford she wants us to know, not the polished star on a poster, but the man who was genuinely aware of the fragility of life. Their relationship didn't end when the African sun set either. Meryl's Exposure covers a 40-year bond that saw them through the highs and lows of their careers. They reunited decades later for Lions for Lambs in 2007, a film Redford directed himself. By then, the dynamic had shifted. He wasn't just her co-star, he was her lovely friend and her director. Meryl talks about the actual Robert Redford behind the camera, a man who was fiercely intellectual, deeply political, and surprisingly self-doubting. She exposes the fact that despite his status, he was always worried about whether he was doing enough for the world. She speaks of their long phone calls and the way they both chose to live un-Hollywood lives. While everyone else was chasing the red carpet, Meryl was in Connecticut and Bob was in Utah. They were two of a kind, outliers who found solace in each other's company because they both understood the burden of being a legend. When Meryl speaks for the first time about his natural personality, she's describing a man who was often lonely in his fame, a man who preferred the company of the mountains to the company of moguls. The real exposure here isn't a scandal. It's a revelation of character. Meryl is telling us that the Robert Redford we saw on screen, the quiet, confident, slightly detached hero, was only half the story. The other half was a man who worked incredibly hard to be that person, a man who felt deeply, and a man who was, in her words, the last of the lions. She's exposing the fact that his cool was often a mask for a very sensitive soul. By the time she reached her 76th birthday, Meryl felt she finally had the perspective to tell the truth. She wanted the world to know that the spark we saw in Out of Africa wasn't just movie magic. It was the beginning of a lifelong reverence. She's exposing the fact that even in a town built on make-believe, what she had with Robert Redford was the most real thing she ever experienced in front of a lens. She speaks about how he looked at her during those final years not as Meryl Streep, the Oscar winner, but as the woman who stood in a dangerous river with him 40 years ago. There's a beautiful, heartbreaking exposure in that realization that even the biggest stars in the world are ultimately just two people trying to find a connection in a chaotic world. Meryl's tribute isn't just about Redford's career. It's about the actual man who taught her that a simple touch, like washing someone's hair, can be more powerful than 1,000 scripted lines. And as she reflects on their collaboration, she makes it clear that while the golden boy may be gone, the man she knew, the one who was divine, even when he was struggling with a bottle of shampoo, is the one she wants us to remember. She's exposing the heart of a legend, and in doing so, she's giving us a final, intimate look at the Robert Redford that only she was allowed to see. One thing is for certain, after hearing Meryl speak, you'll never look at that hair-washing scene the same way again. You won't just see two actors. You'll see the actual beginning of a 40-year love letter between two of the greatest spirits to ever grace the screen. But as Meryl herself would tell you, behind those piercing blue eyes and that effortless cool, Redford was carrying a weight that most of Hollywood never saw until the very end. One of the lions has passed. When the news finally broke on September 16, 2025, that Robert Redford had passed away at the age of 89, it felt as though a mountain had moved. For over 60 years, he was a permanent fixture in the cultural psyche, a face that symbolized a specific kind of American integrity and effortless grace. But as Meryl Streep's recent reflections have exposed, his departure wasn't a Hollywood spectacle. It was a quiet, principled exit that mirrored the way he lived his life. He died at his beloved home in Sundance, Utah, a place he built not just as a residence, but as a sanctuary for art and the environment. He was surrounded by his family and the rugged landscapes he spent half his life trying to protect, leaving behind a void that the industry is still struggling to fathom. Meryl's tribute to him was perhaps the most poignant, stripped of all the usual industry fluff. She didn't call him a star or a legend, though he was both. She called him a lion. One of the lions has passed, she said in her official statement, and that word choice exposes exactly how his peers viewed him. In the animal kingdom, the lion is the king, yes, but it is also a solitary, watchful creature that protects its pride with a quiet, fierce intensity. To Meryl, Redford was the last of a breed of actors who didn't need to shout to be heard. He was a man who commanded the room just by existing within it. Her lovely friend was gone, and with him, a certain era of dignified, thoughtful celebrity seemed to vanish as well. But to perfectly imagine the accurate Robert Redford in his final years, you have to look at the vulnerability he kept hidden from the cameras. While the world saw the silver-haired icon, those closest to him saw a man who had been deeply weathered by personal grief. The most significant exposure of his later life was how he handled the devastating loss of his son, James, in 2020. James was a documentary filmmaker and an activist, very much his father's son, and his death from bile duct cancer at the age of 58 shattered Redford. Those who knew him say he was never quite the same after that. It exposed a layer of profound sadness that he had managed to keep at bay for decades. It reminded the world that even the golden boy, the man who seemed to have everything, was not immune to the most visceral kinds of human pain. In the months following his death, the tributes that poured in from his co-stars provided a mosaic of the man behind the myth. Barbra Streisand, his partner in the unforgettable The Way We Were, shared memories that exposed their playful yet intense chemistry. She called him one of the finest actors ever and joked about how they were such opposites. He was the outdoorsy horseman, and she was the Brooklyn girl allergic to everything in nature. Yet, she noted that they shared a pure joy on set. Her tribute touched on Redford's intellectual curiosity, noting that he was always more interested in talking about politics or the state of the world than his own performance. Jane Fonda, who starred with him in 4 films over 5 decades, from the youthful energy of Barefoot in the Park to the quiet autumnal beauty of Our Souls at Night, gave a tribute that was raw and deeply personal. At the 2026 Oscars, she exposed her lifelong crush on him, admitting with a laugh that she was always in love with him. But more importantly, she spoke about his great values. She highlighted how Redford used his power to create a space for others through Sundance, essentially exposing how much of his own wealth and time he poured into making sure independent voices had a stage. She described him not just as a gorgeous human being, but as a man who was deeply suspicious of fame and spent his final years actively trying to dismantle the star system he helped create. Even the younger generation of Hollywood exposed how his shadow loomed large over their careers. Scarlett Johansson, who was just 11 years old when Redford cast her in The Horse Whisperer, remembered him as a patient and warm mentor. She recalled how he never treated her like a child, but as a fellow artist. This reveals the true Redford, a man who didn't care about hierarchy or status, but about the work itself. This sentiment was echoed by countless independent filmmakers who got their start at the Sundance Film Festival. To them, Redford wasn't a face on a poster, he was the godfather of indie cinema, the man who fought the studio moguls so that stories about real people could be told. The 2026 awards season became a prolonged celebration of his life, but it was Meryl Streep who provided the closing argument on his legacy. In her most recent exposure of their bond, she spoke about his final months in Utah. She described a man who had moved past the need for accolades. He was, as she put it, at peace with the mountains. He spent his final days watching the seasons change, deeply engaged in environmental activism until the very end. He didn't want a grand funeral. He wanted his land to stay wild. This exposed the ultimate truth about Robert Redford. He was a man who spent his whole life being looked at, but he only ever felt truly seen when he was looking at nature or working with his friends. He was a lion who had finally found his rest, leaving behind a pride of actors and filmmakers who are now tasked with carrying on his rebellious spirit. Meryl's voice, steady and filled with a 40-year deep affection, reminded us that while the screen version of Redford was a masterpiece, the real man, the father, the activist, the shy friend who was bad at washing hair but great at protecting souls, was the true work of art. So, how did a kid from Santa Monica who hated the spotlight end up becoming the very definition of the American dream? The architect of indie, who was Robert Redford. So, how did a kid from Santa Monica who hated the spotlight end up becoming the very definition of the American dream? It's a question that exposes the ultimate paradox of Robert Redford's life. To the world, he was the untouchable golden boy with the flawless jawline and the Midas touch at the box office. But if you ask those who knew him, or if you look at the paper trail of his 89 years, you find a man who was constantly trying to run away from that very image. The right Robert Redford wasn't a product of Hollywood glamour. He was a rebel, a struggling painter, and a man who felt more at home in a dusty canyon than on a red carpet. The story begins in Santa Monica in 1936, but not the glamorous Santa Monica we know today. Redford grew up in a working-class neighborhood, the son of a milkman turned accountant. From the very start, he was an outsider. He was a kid who asked too many questions, a boy who felt an unrest in his soul because his parents were such polar opposites. His mother was the one who ignited his lust for knowledge and art, while his father was a man of strict requirements. This tension exposed a drive in young Bob to find his own path. He wasn't interested in the conveyor belt life. In fact, he once won a drawing competition where the prize was a job at Disney Studios cleaning celluloid boards. He hated it. To him, it felt like a factory. He wanted something real. After a stint at the University of Colorado, where he was more interested in drinking and mischief than studying, he hit a crossroads. His mother passed away when he was only 19, a loss that exposed a deep well of grief and sent him fleeing to Europe. This is the chapter of his life most people forget. Robert Redford, the starving artist. He lived in Paris and Florence, studying fine art, living on cheese and water, and sleeping on floors. He was a radical student, joining demonstrations and soaking up the actual world outside the American bubble. When he returned to the States, he didn't head for Hollywood. He headed for Brooklyn to study at the Pratt Institute. He wanted to be a painter. Acting was honestly a fluke, something he took up because he thought it might help him understand composition and movement for his art. But Hollywood has a way of finding faces like his. By the time the late 60s rolled around, the Golden Boy was born, whether he liked it or not. 1969 was the year everything changed with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. It was the film that exposed his incredible chemistry with Paul Newman and turned him into a global phenomenon. But look at his choices after that. A man who only cared about fame would have taken every romantic lead offered to him. Redford did the opposite. He used his newfound power to make movies that mattered. He gave us The Sting, yes, but he also fought tooth and nail to produce All the President's Men. Meryl Streep often talks about how actual Redford was a man of deep political conviction, and All the President's Men is the proof. He was obsessed with the Watergate story, not because it was hot news, but because he cared about the integrity of the truth. He spent years visiting newsrooms, hanging out with reporters like Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, trying to understand the actual mechanics of journalism. He was exposing the corruption of power long before it was trendy to do so. He was a producer who took risks, often putting his own money on the line to tell stories that the big studios thought were too intellectual or dry. Redford's acting career began in New York City, where he worked both on stage and in television. His Broadway debut was in a small role in Tall Story, followed by parts in The Highest Tree and Sunday in New York. His biggest success on Broadway was as the stuffy newlywed husband of Elizabeth Ashley in the original 1963 cast of Neil Simon's Barefoot in the Park. Starting in 1960, Redford appeared as a guest star on numerous television drama programs, including Naked City, Maverick, The Untouchables, The Americans, Whispering Smith, Perry Mason, Alfred Hitchcock, Presents, Route 66, Dr. Kildare, Playhouse 90, Tate, The Twilight Zone, The Virginian, and Captain Brassbound's Conversion, among others. And then, of course, there is the greatest exposure of his career, Sundance. In the late 70s, Redford looked at Hollywood and saw a machine that was crushing independent voices. He saw a system that only cared about blockbusters and pretty things. So he did something radical. He went to the mountains of Utah, bought land with his own hands, and started the Sundance Institute. He almost went bankrupt doing it. People in the industry laughed at him. They called it Redford's folly. But he didn't care. He wanted to expose the world to different stories, indigenous voices, experimental filmmakers, and stories that wake up the heart. He turned a small canyon into the epicenter of global cinema, proving that his actual legacy wasn't just his face on a screen, but the thousands of careers he launched for others. His personal life was just as un-Hollywood. He married Lola Van Wagenen in 1958 before he was anyone. They went through the unthinkable tragedy of losing their first son, Scott, to SYDS just 2 months after he was born. This exposed a layer of resilience in Redford that defined his fatherhood. He and Lola had 3 more children, and he spent his life trying to shield them from the toxic side of fame. When they divorced after nearly 30 years, it wasn't for a tabloid reason. They had simply grown into different people. He eventually found a second life with Sibylle Sagers, a German artist and environmentalist who shared his true passions. They lived quietly in Utah, focused on art and the earth, far away from the paparazzi. Redford was a man who was burned in effigy in Utah in the 70s because he fought against coal plants. He was a man who stood before the United Nations in 2015 and told world leaders that moderate weather is going extinct. He was an activist who put his reputation on the line for the land he loved. This is Robert Redford, a man who used his golden boy status as a shield to protect the things that truly mattered. He was a rebel against established conventions, as one biographer put it, a man who pushed the envelope until the very day he died. As Meryl Streep looks back on him at 76, she sees all of this. She sees the painter who never stopped drawing, the father who carried his grief with dignity, and the titan who built an empire for the underdog. She's exposing the fact that the most interesting thing about Robert Redford wasn't his looks or his Oscars, but his refusal to be what everyone else wanted him to be. He was a man of the mountains, a man of the truth, and a man who, in the end, found exactly the kind of peace he had been searching for since he left Santa Monica as a restless boy. It's a legacy that mirrors the only woman who could ever truly match his screen presence, the woman who started this conversation. Redford's quiet exit and final roles. As we look at the real Robert Redford in his twilight years, it's clear that his approach to retirement was as meticulously crafted as any of his Oscar-winning performances. He didn't just fade away, he chose a deliberate, graceful transition that focused on quality over quantity. For a man who spent his life being chased by the paparazzi, his final decade was an exposure of what it truly means to age with dignity in a youth-obsessed industry. He officially announced his retirement from acting in 2018, but as Meryl Streep recently noted, a lion like Redford never really stops hunting for the truth. He just changes the terrain. His final starring role in The Old Man and the Gun was the perfect meta goodbye to his audience. Playing Forrest Tucker, a real-life career criminal who robbed banks well into his 70s, not for the money, but for the thrill of it, Redford was essentially playing a version of himself. He exposed his own career-long obsession with the gentleman outlaw archetype, the man who breaks the rules but does so with a wink and a sense of honor. Critics noted that his performance was filled with a twinkling eye and a sly grin that felt like a secret shared between him and the viewers. It was a role that summarized his entire screen persona: charming, slightly dangerous, and impossible to pin down. But Redford couldn't resist one final, surprising exposure for the modern era. In a move that shocked many purists, he reprised his role as Alexander Pierce in Avengers: Endgame for a brief cameo. This choice revealed the actual Redford's lack of pretension. He wasn't too big for a superhero movie. He understood that cinema was evolving, and he wanted to be part of the final chapter of a saga that reached millions across generations. It was his last on-screen appearance, a quiet tip of the hat to the new generation of stars before he retreated to his ranch in Utah. In his final years, Redford became a ghost in the best possible way. He exposed the fact that a legend doesn't need to be seen to be relevant. He spent his days in Sundance, focusing on his first love, painting. He also became more vocal than ever about environmental conservation, treating the protection of the American West as his most important role to date. He wasn't interested in the victory lap of talk shows and memoirs. As Meryl points out, he was at peace because he had finally shed the golden boy skin and become the actual man he always wanted to be, a steward of the land and a mentor to the next wave of rebels. His retirement wasn't an end, but a return to the quiet, creative solitude he had craved since his youth. The Iron Ladies Marathon. If Redford was the golden boy who ran away from the spotlight, Meryl Streep is the Iron Lady who mastered it without ever letting it consume her. At 76, her recent exposure of Redford is only possible because she has outlasted almost every other titan of her era. Her career isn't just a list of credits. It's a marathon of artistic evolution that paved the way for her to work with, and eventually speak for, legends like Redford. From her first feature in 1977's Julia to her record-breaking 21 Oscar nominations, Meryl has exposed the secret to longevity, constant reinvention, and a refusal to be just a pretty face. Working with Redford on Out of Africa in the 80s was a collision of two very different schools of acting. Meryl, the trained chameleon of the stage, and Redford, the intuitive minimalist screen star. This collaboration exposed a mutual respect that redefined both of them. While Redford taught her how to protect her family from the Hollywood machine, Meryl showed him that a woman could lead a blockbuster with just as much gravity as any man. Their bond was forged in the actual grit of those Kenyan sets, and it gave Meryl the unique perspective she now uses to tell his story. Throughout her long span, Meryl has worked with everyone, from Clint Eastwood to Al Pacino. But she always returned to the true friendship she found with Redford. She exposed the reality that in a business of props and poses, finding a fellow artist who values character over celebrity is the rarest treasure of all. Her career has been a series of exposures of different accents, different souls, and different eras, but her tribute to Redford is her most personal one yet. It's the story of two outliers who conquered the system and came out the other side with their hearts intact. She has spent 50 years proving that a woman's strong power in Hollywood grows with age, not diminishes. And by speaking up for Redford now, she isn't just protecting his legacy, she's solidifying her own as the ultimate truth-teller of her generation. As she looks back, Meryl exposes the most important lesson of all. The movies are great, but the friendships are what make life divine. If you're a fan of Redford, comment down below your favorite film of his. Subscribe to the channel for more stories just like this.